Greetings and welcome to episode 4 of KurtApproved with me, Kurt Wilson. We're still going to be doing the influencers in this cast and probably the next couple. There's several good ones yet to talk about and discuss. I just wanted to cover something that I kind of maybe skipped in that very first one when I kind of introduced who I was and the thought process behind this podcast and such. I guess one of the things that I've struggled with doing this is that there are times when I come up against words that I struggle with being able to pronounce correctly. It's something that I've dealt with pretty much my whole life. A learning disability. I kind of equate it to like a stutter where the word in my head is said correctly, but when it comes out, it just, I struggle with it. Something that I've worked on, and I think most people at some point kind of might have similar struggles with different areas of their abilities, spelling or what have you, and we find other words to use rather than the word that we're struggling to spell and such. But as I go through all of this stuff, more so with the stuff where I'm reading somebody's text and not having a conversation one-on-one, I try to stay true to the text, what's written there. And every once in a while I do struggle with the word or try to substitute a different one, and that's kind of the pause and such. But I own it. It's something that I've always dealt with. I'm conscious of it. Sometimes good, bad, or indifferent. But it's just one of them things that I've learned to cope with, and people do pick it up. And some people choose to single it out and pick on me about it or however you want to say that. It is what it is, man. It's something that I've worked to correct, and there just doesn't seem to be a magic pill on it. Took speech most of my life through grade school and worked with a speech therapist to pronounce words and such, and there's just certain vowels and consonants that I struggle with. I deal with it. I guess you could say it kind of make me come across as being unintelligent. I don't believe that. Like I said, the words are in my head. I just can't get them out in a way that they sound normal to most. I own that. It is kind of what has made me the person I am today. So as we go forward, I'm sure there's going to be words that I struggle with. That's life, So now that I just wanted to bring that up and cover that. So moving forward, the next person is Confucius. And I think we all are familiar with Confucius because we have the memes or the stickers or whatever that Confucius says. But, I mean, do we really know who we're quoting? I think more and more every day, thanks to the Twitter and the Book of Face and any other platform, I guess TikTok, whatever. I think people share stuff without really knowing who or what they're sharing 100%. So, Confucius was born in 551 in China. Was born in a period of religious and cultural turmoil. His family may have been aristocrats' roots, but were relatively poor at the time of his birth. His father was a soldier who died when Confucius was just 3 years old. As a result, he was brought up by his mother, who kindly, or who nurtured his love of learning, seeking wisdom. From a young age, he sought out teachers who could instruct him in all aspects of life. So his mother must have saw something in him and decided that rather than oppress it, she was going to nurture it and encourage him to follow that. He would go on and study history and poetry. Back to the bio. After the death of his mother, Confucius spent 3 years in seclusion and bereavement, and this enabled him to focus on perfecting his ideals. At the end of his period of seclusion, he became a teacher, teaching people from all classes in the ancient arts. Confucius taught the importance of self introspection. So he wanted people to make sure that they looked in rather out. Back to the bio, in particular, valuing the true and honest motive and performing one's duty to the best of their ability. Confucius was widely loved by his students. Breaking with tradition, he became friendly with them and got to know them on a personal level. His style of teaching also varied depending on their personalities and character traits. He was not stuck in a rigid mode of teaching, but took an innovative approach which led to the real sense of loyalty amongst his students. Ironically, after his death, his teaching became heavily formalized and was often implemented quite rigidly. So here's Confucius realizing that people all learn differently. They all have different personalities, and once you understand the person, their learning becomes easier. But at the time, that was unheard of, and you were supposed to follow this and these guidelines and follow it and don't step outside of it. Back to the bio. Despite his glowing reputation and an increasing number of students, Confucius often encountered difficulties from those who oppressed him and were jealous of his influence. He tried for many years to put his ideas into practice, getting involved in public service. However, he became frustrated at the corruption and the self-interest which was dominant in the courts of influence. Towards the end of his life, Confucius despaired at the possibility of ever returning society to justice and order. So he had a focus. He saw the problem and just felt that he couldn't do anything about it. Today, I think a lot of people feel the same way, and then there are people that aren't going to let anything hold them back. Back to the bio. So Confucius did not claim miracles or any divinity, but had great faith in the power of education. Respect for the past, righteousness, and the reform of corrupt practices. His own life was not particularly remarkable, and he was beset by many challenges, such as the death of his parents and the political turmoil of his era. However, to Confucius, dealing with everyday difficulties was an essential part of reforming your character and becoming a better person. So, like I said, in the previous podcast, some of these bios really don't do these people justice. Confucius was a great educator. He changed the way teaching was conducted, and had such an influence that people decided to adapt his teachings, but then told people they couldn't step outside of them, which was just a huge contradiction of everything that he was teaching. So the next influencer, some people are going to know the last name, may know who this gentleman is. I think you might be surprised what else this gentleman was known for, what he did or created, and this is Louis Pasteur. Was born in France. One of his professors called him mediocre. He received a doctorate in 1847. He was born in 1822. So his most important discoveries were in the field of germ study. He showed that germs required certain microorganisms to develop. Using this knowledge, he found that the fermentation of yeast could be delayed. Louis Pasteur then turned to practical ways of killing bacteria in liquids such as milk. His process of pasteurization successfully killed bacteria in milk without destroying milk protein. This was a radical discovery and made drinking milk safe. The process of pasteurization was named after him, and it saved many lives. So I believe most people know or taught about Louis Pasteur for the pasteurization. I mean, and milk's the prime example. They pasteurize other products and such, just as it says, to kill the germs. Can you imagine if this process never came about and you when drinking milk it was unsafe? It'd be interesting to see what liquid we would have been relying on for so many things. Back to the bio. Pasteur was a great believer in hard work and never content to rest on his laurels. He continued to work very hard in his laboratory to develop more cures. He said in an advice to other scientists, an individual who gets used to hard work can therefore never live without it. Work is the foundation of everything in this world. True statement right there. Any individual who gets used to hard work can therefore never live without it. Work is the foundation of everything in the world. In 1870, Louis Pasteur sought to find a cure for anthrax, a disease that mainly affects cattle. Firstly, he found anthrax was much more likely if farmers buried dead sheep with disease in fields. Pasteur was able to advise farmers not to bury any dead animals in areas where cattle may graze in the future. In 1881, he conducted an experiment by implementing his vaccine for anthrax, which was successful. The success of the cure for anthrax encouraged Pasteur to develop a cure for rabies, a very common disease at the time. Using similar principles, he developed a weakened strain of the disease. Testing on animals affected with rabies was successful. However, he was reluctant to test on humans for fear it might not work. At one point, he considered testing on himself, subjecting himself to rabies and then trying his cure. However, before he could implement his scheme, a young boy was brought to him which had been bitten 14 times by a rabid dog. His parents agreed to try the uncertain new technique. His treatment was a success, and news of the treatment soon spread. Over 350 people came to Louis Pasteur for treatment. Louis and his team of scientists worked around the clock to save the people who had contracted rabies. There was only one failure, a 10-year-old girl. Louis knew the case was too advanced when she came, but he tried nevertheless. The girl died in his arms with tears in his eyes. The great scientist said to her parents, "I did so wish I could have saved your little one." So here's a guy that finds a cure for anthrax, finds a cure for rabies, and comes up with pasteurization. If you change one of those three, take two of those three away. Maybe somebody else discovers it, probably so. You don't know the time frame, but just you talk about the influence right there, or the mark, the impact that this gentleman has. Pasteur dies in 1895 at the age of 73. Back to the bio. Pasteur had a great faith in the good nature of humans. He worked tirelessly to deliver real benefits for the treatment of infectious diseases. More than any other person, Louis Pasteur helped to increase average life expectancy in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Like I said, pasteurization of making milk safe to drink, cure for rabies, anthrax. Just a powerhouse of a guy here, working in a field to improve people's lives and to make life expectancy longer. He himself living to 73, just unbelievable. Next influencer, Albert Einstein. I think most people have a idea of who Einstein was. If anything, E equals mc squared. The pictures of him in his later life, his hair unkept, and all of that. That's probably the image most people see. From the bio. Einstein was born the 14th of March in 1879 in Germany. His parents were working class, salesman, engineer, and a non-observant Jew. At age 15, the family moved to Milan, Italy, where his father hoped Albert would become a mechanical engineer. However, despite Einstein's intellect and thirst for knowledge, his early academic reports suggested anything but a glittering career in the education. So his teachers found him dim and slow to learn. Part of the problem was that Albert expressed no interest in learning languages. He's quoted as saying, "School failed me and I failed the school. It bored me. The teachers behaved like sergeants. I wanted to learn what I wanted to know, but they wanted me to learn for the exam." So here's a guy going through school and could have used Confucius as an instructor, because Confucius would have picked up on this and taught Albert a different way. But here they are teaching the students to pass exams rather than in a way that this information is useful. So at the age of 12, to the bio. At the age of 12, Einstein picked up a book on geometry and read it cover to cover. He would later refer to it as his holy booklet. He became fascinated with math and taught himself, becoming acquainted with great scientific discoveries of the age. Despite Albert's independent learning, he languished at school. Eventually, he was asked to leave by the authorities because his indifference was setting a bad example to the other students. He applied for admission to the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. His first attempt was a failure because he failed exams in botany, zoology, and languages. However, he passed the next year and in 1900 became a Swiss citizen. So, here's a guy that's asked to leave because he's setting a bad example. Makes me wonder how many people that I went to school with or have crossed paths with that were thought in the same light and not given the opportunity any further. There's something definitely to be said about teaching to an exam. If that's the case, then the person is teaching to make sure that their ego, that the instructor, teacher, whatever word you want to use for this person, needs these people to pass the exam because that makes them look good. But if you teach through the material and your students, disciples, whatever, understand what you're teaching, the exam's the easy part. That they own the information, and anything on that exam they're going to be able to tackle. It's I guess the mindset of the person standing up and doing the teaching on how they want to present it and such. Back to the bio. In 1896, Einstein renounces his German citizenship to avoid the military obligation. For 5 years, he was stateless because he was stateless before successfully applying for Swiss citizenship in 1901. After graduating from the Zurich College, he attempted to gain a teaching post, but none was forthcoming. Instead, he gained a job with the Swiss Patent Office. While working at the Patent Office, Einstein continued his own scientific discoveries and began radical experiments to consider the nature of light in space. He published his first scientific paper in 1900, and by 1905 had completed his PhD entitled A New Determination of Molecular Dimensions. In addition to working on his PhD, Einstein was also working feverishly on other papers. In 1905, he published 4 pivotal scientific works, which would revolutionize modern physics. Einstein worked to gain recognition, and he was given a post at the University of Zurich 1909, and in 1911 was offered the post of full professor. That professorship was in Prague, which was then part of the Austria-Hungary Empire. He took Austrian-Hungary citizenship to accept the job. So the citizenship thing kind of important because, 1911 and such, you've got a world war getting ready to come about. Some of it started. So back to the bio, quantum theory. Einstein suggested that light doesn't just travel as waves, but as electric currents. This photoelectric effect could force metals to release a tiny stream of particles known as quanta. From this quantum theory, other inventors were able to develop devices such as televisions and movies. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1921. Special theory of relativity. This theory was written in a simple style with no footnotes or academic reference. The core of his theory of relativity is that movement can only be detected and measured as relative movement, that the change of position of one body in respect to another. He also said that if electrons traveled at close to the speed of light, their weight would increase. This led to Einstein's famous equation of E equals mc squared, where E is energy, m is mass, and c is the speed of light. I can only imagine him doing all of this and talking about it. And what, some people were thinking. So back to the bio. As a German Jew, Einstein was threatened by the rise of the Nazi Party. In 1933, when the Nazis seized power, they confiscated Einstein's property and later started burning his books. Einstein, then in England, took an offer to go to Princeton University in the U.S. He later wrote that he never had strong opinions about race and nationality, but saw himself as a citizen of the world. Once in the U.S., Einstein dedicates himself to a strict discipline of academic study. He would spend no time on maintaining his dress and image. He considered those things unessential and meant less time for research. Einstein was notoriously absent-minded. So later in life, he decides that maintaining dress and image is a complete waste of time, and it's taking up time that he could use for other stuff. And you could say that he was disciplined in that belief. Back to the bio. On the outbreak of war in 1939, Einstein wrote President Roosevelt about the prospect of Germany developing the atomic bomb. He warned Roosevelt that the Germans were working on a bomb with a devastating potential. Roosevelt heeds his advice and starts the Manhattan Project to develop the U.S. atomic bomb. But after the war ended, Einstein reverted to his pacifist views. Einstein said, after the war, had I known that Germany would not succeed in producing an atomic bomb, I would not have lifted a finger. As they say, hindsight being 20/20, right? Again, the bio does not do Einstein justice. I think most, like I said, know E equals mc squared, or the unkept professor. Some of these people are definitely going to have to get more time to them. Um, the next influencer for sure. There's no way this bio that I found covers, encapsulates everything. And that influencer is John F. Kennedy. There's so much to tell, not just only about JFK, John Kennedy, but the whole Kennedy clan, that family, Joe Kennedy, all of that, So, according to the bio, born in May of 1917, John F. Kennedy comes from a political family. His father, Joseph Kennedy, was a leading member of the Democratic Party, and Joseph encouraged JFK and his political ambitions after the war. John would attend Harvard and graduate from there. Before America joined the war, John joined the Navy and saw action throughout the Pacific Theater. The war would be WW2, World War II. In August 1943, his boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer. John F. Kennedy was later decorated for his outstanding bravery in rescuing a fellow crewman. He was also awarded the Purple Heart for an incident later in the war. Afterwards, Kennedy was modest about his actions, saying he felt a bit embarrassed as it resulted from a botched military action. There's a guy taking ownership of the situation. Yeah. If the operation wasn't botched, as those events transpire and happen. Back to the bio. In 1946, he won a seat in Boston for the U.S. House of Representatives, and in 1952 got himself elected to the U.S. Senate, defeating the incumbent Republican. 1956, he was newly chosen to be the vice president candidate for Adlai Stevenson. The national exposure raised his profile, and in 1960, he was selected to be the Democratic nominee for the presidency. The presidency. In 1960, in a very tight election, John F. K. narrowly defeated the much-fancied Republican Richard Nixon. It was a memorable election with many millions glued to the TV in the pre-election. JFK came across very well on TV and looked more relaxed and professional on cameras. It was the first time a Roman Catholic had been elected president, and it was a big issue in America, where many Protestants distrusted the prospect of America being influenced by the Vatican. He had to assure voters he was not a Catholic candidate for presidency, but someone standing for president who happened to be Catholic. During his inauguration, JFK gave a memorable speech where he famously encouraged citizens to help the nation become strong again. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. We will make clear that America's enduring concern is both for peace and freedom, that we are anxious to live in harmony with the Russian people, that we seek no conquest, no satellites, no riches, that we seek only the day where the nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. One of his early acts was to establish the Peace Corps, a volunteer program run by the U.S. government. It allowed young Americans to travel abroad and serve in developing countries. Kennedy hoped it would change foreign perceptions of Americans and give Americans a greater sense of international solidarity. In 1961, after pressure from the CIA, Kennedy reluctantly ordered the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. It was mostly led by Cuban exiles with minimal U.S. support. They hoped to overthrow the communist Fidel Castro. However, the invasion was a failure, leading to embarrassing negotiations with Fidel Castro. Despite being reluctant to go along with the policy, he accepted responsibility for its failures. That was just the beginning of the dance. So, in 1962, the world came extraordinarily close to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union moved missiles to Cuba, which was seen as a very proactive. Many in the American military were keen on preemptive airstrikes on the missile bases, but Kennedy chose a more cautious diplomatic approach. Kennedy found a way to offer Khrushchev a way out without losing face. After several days of tense negotiations, an agreement was reached where the Soviet Union would remove missiles from Cuba in return for the U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. The U.S. also secretly removed weapons from Turkey to pacify the Soviets. His careful handling of the situation was widely praised. It led to an establishment of direct Moscow-Washington hotline. And for years, tensions between the Cold War countries were reduced. You go from the Bay of Pigs to Cuban Missile Crisis, and you would think, okay, that's a full presidency. But you got to talk about Vietnam and some other topics here. So back to the bio. During his brief presidency, John F. Kennedy oversaw an escalation of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, which included sending 16,000 military advisors to the country. Later, Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, said Kennedy considered pulling out of Vietnam in '63 and believed that if Kennedy had survived, American involvement would have ended, foreshadowing Kennedy's assassination. We'll get to that, but it's not that I don't think Kennedy didn't believe in the war. It just he saw that the war was not the path. We'll talk about Vietnam, I'm sure, at another date. And then civil rights pops up during his presidency as well. Back to the bio. Kennedy was a supporter of civil rights, but when elected in 1960, American society was deeply divided, with the entrenched opposition in the end of segregation and racism. Kennedy was torn between the need to retain the support of white Southern Democrat voters and a wish to promote civil rights. He supported voter registration drives, appointed African Americans to positions within his administration, and promoted Thurgood Marshall to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in New York. However, this was insignificant to tackle the much larger injustices. During the 1960s, the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King became disappointed with JFK's apparent non-committal stance. Instead, they looked nonviolent they took nonviolent direct action to highlight the injustice of segregation and the civil rights. This often led to shocking images shown on TV of police brutality against civil rights activists. A turning point was the 3rd of May, 1963, where police in Birmingham unleashed shocking brutality against protesters. Kennedy takes more direct action, sending federal marshals into the South in order to prevent racial violence getting out of hand. On 11th June of 1963, Kennedy made a televised address to the nation where he spoke clearly in favor of the need to pass civil rights legislation. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities. Whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves. Yet, their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. Although he did not live to see his promise enacted, it was a turning point in his presidency with clear commitment made. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed racial segregation. And then that fateful day in Dallas in 1963. John F. Kennedy was assassinated November of 1963. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and put on trial for his murder. However, before he could reach trial, Lee Harvey Oswald was himself killed by Jack Ruby. Lee Harvey Oswald always pleaded his innocence, and many believed the assassination was a wider conspiracy. His death left a large void in American politics that was never adequately filled. Though Johnson did enact the civil rights legislation and a form of welfare state, which many see as something Kennedy was keen to do. We're not going to talk about Robert Kennedy, but Robert Kennedy was assassinated in 1968 while seeking the Democratic presidency. Again, just barely touching anything here on Kennedy. You could probably spend hours upon hours talking about the conspiracy theory on the assassination, the grassy knoll, the magic bullet, what he did for the Civil Rights Act to get that program moving. Again, hours upon hours on the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs. And then there's just the whole what if conversation. What if he lived? Where would the nation have gone? There's all kinds of books written about everything that I just talked about that have different outlooks. The Kennedys just have an air about them and such. So the next influencer, it's kind of fitting to follow Kennedy, is Rosa Parks. Rosa was born in Alabama on February 4th, 1913. She attended local rural schools, and after the age of 11, the industrial school for girls in Montgomery. However, she later had to opt out of school to look after her grandmother. As a child, Rosa became aware of the segregation which was deeply embedded in Alabama. She experienced deep-rooted racism and became conscious of the different opportunities faced by white and black children. She also recalls seeing the Ku Klux Klan march go past her house. Kind of fast forwards here, and they skip up to 1932 when she married Raymond Parks, a barber from Montgomery. He was active in the NAACP, and Rosa became a supporter, helping with fundraising and other areas. She would attend meetings defending the rights of black people and seeking to prevent injustice. So, I mean, I don't know how many people actually don't know the whole story. We're going to touch on it just a little bit. So, back to the bio. After a day at work at the Montgomery Fair Department store, Parks boards the Cleveland Avenue bus at around 6 p.m. Thursday, 1 December 1955 in downtown Montgomery. She paid her fare and sat in an empty seat in the first row of black seats reserved for black in the colored section, which was near the middle of the bus and directly behind the 10 seats reserved for white passengers. Initially, she had not noticed that the bus driver was the same man, James F. Blank, who had left her in the rain in 1943. As the bus traveled along its regular route, all of the white-only seats in the bus filled up. The bus reached the third stop in front of the Empire Theater, and several white passengers boarded. In 1900, Montgomery had passed a city ordinance for the purpose of segregating passengers by race. Conductors were given the power to assign seats to accomplish that purpose. However, no passenger would be required to move or give up their seat and stand if the bus was crowded and no other seats were available. Over time, and by custom, however, Montgomery bus drivers had adopted the practice of requiring black riders to move whenever there were no white seats left. You let something go on and change, and what isn't the guideline becomes the norm. Enough people do it. Nobody looks back. Nobody says nothing. Back to the bio. Following standard practice, the bus driver, Blake, noted that the front of the bus was filled with white passengers and there were 2 or 3 men standing. Therefore, he moved the colored section sign back behind Parks and demanded that 4 black people give up their seats in the middle section so that the white passengers could sit. Years later, in recalling the events of the day, Parks said, when that white driver stepped back towards us, when he waved his hand and ordered us up and out of our seats, I felt a determination cover my body like a quilt on a winter night. By Parks' account, Blake said, y'all better make it light on yourselves and let me have those seats. 3 of them complied, Parks said. The driver wanted us to stand up, the 4 of us. We didn't move at the beginning, but he says, let me have these seats, and the other 3 people moved, but I didn't. The black man sitting next to her gave up his seat. Parks moved, but towards the window seat. She did not move to the newly repositioned colored section. Blake then said, "Why don't you stand up?" Parks responded, "I don't think I should have to stand up." Blake called the police to arrest Parks. When recalling the incident for Eyes on the Prize in 1987, a public television series on civil rights movement, Parks said, "When he saw me still sitting, he asked if I was going to stand up, and I said, 'No, I'm not.' And he said, 'Well, if you don't stand up, I'm going to have to call the police and have you arrested.' I said, 'You may do that.'" During a 1956 radio interview with Sidney Rogers in West Oakland, Parks was asked why she decided not to vacate her bus seat. Parks said, I would have to know for once and for all what rights I had as a human being and as a citizen of Montgomery, Alabama. People, and she went on to say, people always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically, or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me of being old then. I was 42. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in. So she's laying it all out there. She's doing this to find out exactly where the line is and where she stands, how she's going to be treated. So back to the bio. When Parks refused to give up her seat, a police officer arrested her. As the officer took her away, she recalled that she said, "Why do you push us around?" The officer's response, as she remembered it, was, "I don't know, but the law's the law, and you're under arrest." She later said, "I only knew that as I was being arrested that it was the very last time that I would ever ride in being humiliated of this kind." So Parks was charged with violation of Chapter 6, Section 11, segregation law of the Montgomery City Code, even though she technically had not taken up the white-only seat. She had been in the colored section. E.D. Nixon and Clifford Durr bailed Parks out of jail the evening of December 1st. That evening, Nixon conferred with Alabama State College professor Joanne Robinson about Parks' case. Robinson, a member of the Women's Political Course, WPC, stayed up all night mimeographing over 35,000 handbills announcing a bus boycott. The Women's Political Council was the first group to officially endorse the boycott. On Sunday, 4th December 1955, plans for the Montgomery bus boycott was announced at black churches in the area, and front page article in the Montgomery Advertiser helped spread the word. At a church rally that night, attendees unanimously agreed to continue the boycott until they were treated with the level of courtesy they expected, until black drivers were hired, and until seating in the middle of the bus was handled on a first-come basis. 4 days later, Parks was tried on charges of disorderly conduct violating a local ordinance. The trial lasted 30 minutes. Parks was found guilty and fined $10 plus $4 court costs. Parks appealed her conviction and formally challenged the legality of racial segregation. In a 1992 interview with the National Public Radio, NPR, NPR's Lynn Neary, Parks recalled, "I did not want to be mistreated. I did not want to be deprived of a seat that I had paid for. It was just time. There was opportunity for me to take a stand to express the way I felt after being treated in that manner. I had not planned to get arrested. I had plenty to do without having to end up in jail. But when I had to face that decision, I didn't hesitate to do so because I felt that we had endured that too long. And the more we gave in, the more we complied with that kind of treatment, the more oppression it became." On Monday, 5th December 1955, after the success of the one-day boycott, a group of 16 to 18 people gathered at the Mount Zion AME Zion Church to discuss boycott strategy. The group agreed that a new organization was needed to lead the boycott effort if it were to continue. Reverend Ralph David suggested the name Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA. The name was adopted and the MIA was formed. Its members elected as their president a relative newcomer to Montgomery, a young and mostly unknown minister of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That Monday night, 50 leaders of the African American community gathered to discuss the proper actions to be taken in response to Parks' arrest. E.D. Nixon said, "My God, look what segregation has put in my hands." Parks was the ideal plaintiff for a test case against the city and state segregation laws. While the 15-year-old Claudette Cloven, unwed and pregnant, had been deemed unacceptable to be the center of the civil rights mobilization, King stated that Miss Parks, on the other hand, was regarded as one of the finest citizens of Montgomery. Not one of the finest Negro citizens, but one of the finest citizens of Montgomery. Parks was securely married and employed, possessed a quiet and dignified demeanor, and was politically savvy. The day of Parks' trial, Monday, December 5th, 55, WPC distributes more than 35,000 leaflets. The handbill read, "We are asking every Negro to stay off the bus Monday in protest of the arrest and trial. You can afford to stay out of school for one day. If you work, take a cab or walk. But please, children, grown-ups, don't ride the bus at all on Monday. Please stay off the buses Monday." Rained that day, but the black community boycott continued. Some rode in carpools, while others traveled in black-operated cabs that charged the same fare as the bus, 10 cents. Most of the remainder of the 40,000 black commuters walked, some as far as 20 miles. In the end, the boycott lasted 382 days. Dozens of public buses stood idle for months, severely damaging the bus transit company's financials, until the law requiring segregation on public buses was lifted. It wasn't a quick turnaround. Some segregationists retaliate with terrorism. Black churches were burned or dynamited. Martin Luther King's home was bombed in the early morning hours of January 30th of 56, and E.D. Nixon's house was also attacked. However, the black community's bus boycott marked one of the largest and most successful mass movements against radical segregation. It sparked many other protests, and it catapulted King to the forefront of the civil rights movement. Though her role in sparking the boycott, Rosa Parks played an important part in the internationalizing the awareness of the plight of the African Americans in the civil rights struggle. King wrote in his 1958 book, Stride Toward Freedom, that Parks' arrest was the cause of the protest. The cause lay deep in the record of similar injustice. Actually, no one can understand the action of Mrs. Parks unless he realizes that eventually the cup of endurance runs over and the human personality cries out, "I can't take it no longer." The Montgomery bus boycott was also the inspiration for the bus boycott in the township of Alexander, Eastern Cape of South Africa, which was one of the key events in radicalization of black majority of that country under leadership of the African National Congress. You know, I think a lot of people just stop and think of Rosa Parks as the person that refused to give her seat up, not knowing the whole story. I know I didn't have all of that, and they understand the bus boycott, how long it took, and the change that came from it. Back to bio. So after the boycott, Rosa Parks became an icon and leading spokesperson for civil rights movement in the U.S. Immediately after the boycott, she lost her job in the department store, and for many years she worked as a seamstress. In 1963, she was hired by an African-American U.S. representative. She worked as his secretary until retirement in 1988. The representative said about Parks, "You treated her with deference because she was so quiet and so sincere. Just a very special person." Awards. She was selected to be one of the people to meet Nelson Mandela on his release from prison in 1994. 96, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Bill Clinton, and in 97, awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest award from Congress. Rosa Parks resided in Detroit till she died at the age of 92, October 24th, 2005. So, Kennedy, Parks, King, all of these people are intertwined, and, if Miss Parks didn't do what she did on that day, how much longer would have that taken for that change to come? If Kennedy lives, how much change does he have? How much influence? Yeah, I think some of these people, like I keep saying, there's so many layers to them, and that this little short, hour, maybe 15 minutes of conversation on them, these short bios don't do them justice, but it does cover some stuff that maybe some people don't know. So, just clicked past, north of an hour. So, trying to keep these somewhat short. So, I guess I'm going to wrap this up and just, as these go on, I'm gonna this format's gonna change, but I think there's discussions here, conversations, because I know going forward, the actions of these people are going to have an impact. So, until then, just make sure you stay warm and fuzzy and be careful out there.